Hi, I'm Dr. Susan Smolinski. I'm the director of the New Mexico Poison and Drug Information Center, and a pharmacist by training, doctorate in pharmacy, and also boarded in toxicology.
Welcome, and thank you for joining our Facebook chat today on cannabis. My name's Jacqueline Kakis, and I'm the health education consultant for the New Mexico Poison and Drug Information Center.
All right, I think we can go ahead and get started with any questions that have already been prepared.
Okay, so if my child gets into my cannabis, will I get in trouble if I call the Poison Center for help?
So the answer to that is clearly no, where our goal is to help the callers, help the children, and help make a determination of where that child needs to be treated. If it's safe to treat a child at home, we will recommend that. We will follow up and call and make sure everything is going well and support the parent. But we recognize the Poison and Drug Center gets calls every day on any number of substances that children get into accidentally, and an accidental exposure is an accident. There's no reason to get anyone in trouble for that.
So I'm guessing a lot of our viewers, Susan, might be wondering if it's safe for them to consume cannabis, why would it be a threat to their children in some instances?
Okay, sure. That's a great question, and it goes back to what every medical professional tells parents is children are not little adults. They have different, their body ratios of fat and water are different, their surface area is different, so they react to any chemical or any drug differently than an adult will. And in the case of cannabis, there is greater brain penetration of the cannabis in a child, and it affects their respiratory center where it does not do that in adults. So they can stop breathing, and that's our biggest concern with the kids.
What would be some of the other symptoms or signs of cannabis exposure in a child?
Sure, so they can get similar symptoms to adult, more likely to have inability to walk a straight line. So a child who ordinarily was running around may act like, they were just learning to walk.
Okay.
And stumble around. They will get much more drowsy than an adult will get. And as I said, the difficulty breathing. And kids can also have other neurologic signs like tremor, if their hands are shaking, or and just abnormal behavior. That it may frighten them, whereas an adult knows what to expect.
Right.
And
so it seems like much like alcohol exposure.
It is similar
Yeah.
effects to alcohol, but alcohol causes more vomiting and has some other issues. But
Okay.
yeah. And alcohol can lower blood sugar, whereas cannabis does not do that.
Okay, good to know. What can I do to keep my children safe from cannabis?
Okay, to keep your child safe, it's sort of the same mantra of what we say to keep a child safe from any poisoning. And Jacqueline, as our educator, you do this all the time and communicate with people. But these should be treated as medications, and as with any medication that might be harmful in a child who accidentally gets into it, keep it locked up when you're not using it. I'm a big fan of lock boxes as a method of poison prevention and exposure prevention. So I think that's the best thing. And then the other things that you sort of know to do as an educator is you would not take your medication in front of your child,
right?
Because they may think, especially a lot of the cannabis products are edible and look
just like other food.
They look like other food or drink or candy, and so if the child sees you ingesting the candy bar, they may say, "Oh, here's a candy bar. I'm gonna have some."
And gummies and stuff like that.
Exactly.
So basically, it's keeping these products out of sight and reach of children. and keeping the edibles away from other food and drink to avoid confusion. And like Susan said, lock boxes are the best because that ensures that the intended user is the only one who accesses that, and it's not accessible to the child. So those are best precaution points. So can people call the Poison Control Center if they want to know if they can if it's safe to take cannabis products with other medications and other products?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a fair amount of drug interactions with medications and cannabis taken together. And it can go either way. It can either make the medication you're taking more dangerous or less dangerous, and if it's less dangerous, it's less effective.
Right.
And it also depends on the route. So if you're smoking cannabis, it affects a certain set of liver enzymes, and that goes with a certain set of medications. But if you swallow it, it's a whole other liver enzyme that's affected. So it's really difficult. You may not get this information from the dispensary.
Right.
So the Poison and Drug Information Center is available 24 hours a day, and you can always ask. We're always, our calls are answered by pharmacists, and they're very well versed in these drug interactions and can help advise you as to how to take those together.
Great. All right, so we would love to open the questions up to our joiners, our audience. So if you have any questions, please use the chat button, or you may enter those in the comment section.
Yeah, and you're also streaming to a couple other platforms, and I'll be monitoring that chat myself and let you know if I see any questions.
Okay.
Let's see. We have a couple hellos from various poison information centers, which is exciting. There's one question. I see. Did you see that, Jen?
I did not. I'm not seeing that at all.
The question from the Michigan Poison and Drug Information Center is there any known safe amount of THC in edibles?
All right, so the Michigan Poison Center wants to know if there's any safe amount of THC in edibles. And there is a safe amount. And, the dose in adults, particularly who are taking this for recreational or medicinal purposes, it varies among the individuals. So, the gummies range from 5 to 10 milligrams all the way up to 50 milligrams. Some people may be able to tolerate that high dose, but we always recommend that people start low and go slow, and especially with the edibles, because your body's ability to absorb a swallowed cannabis product, it's slowed down as compared to smoking it. So that if you take, say, a 10 milligram dose and you're thinking, well, this isn't doing anything for me, should I just take another dose, and it's only been 2 hours, it may not have kicked in yet, that first 10 milligrams, and now you've got 20 milligrams, and 3 hours later it kicks in, and you're having difficulty doing your daily functions. So it is individual dependent. Start with a low dose. Many of the products out there do have a low enough dose to be safe, and you can always divide those up. If you have a candy bar, it comes in pieces. Start with a half or a quarter of a piece and see what you tolerate.
All right. I have a question, actually, that I'm just curious about candidly. Are there any substances or things that have direct interactions with cannabis products that you know of? Anything that our viewers can simply be aware of to avoid mixing with cannabis?
Well, in terms of substances, you're talking medications?
Medications or just in general?
Yeah, the obvious one is there is some interaction with alcohol. So alcohol will have additive effects on that ability to have balance, ability to think clearly. It does affect your ability to drive as well. Obviously, we don't want people driving under the influence of ethanol, but a little bit of ethanol plus a little bit of cannabis may make that driving more dangerous. And then in medications, it just highly depends on the medication. I can't think of too many over-the-counter medications that would be an issue. These are mostly prescription medications that we worry about, where it's very important to have a certain dose of that medicine. Say anticonvulsants is a big category. If you have epilepsy and you're taking a medication for epilepsy, chances are that's going to interact with cannabis.
Making it less effective.
Well, it may make it less effective or more effective.
Okay.
So
Looks like we had a follow-up question about our previous question regarding edibles. Cynthia asks, how long should you wait to make a determination if an edible is working?
I generally recommend that you wait at least 4 hours, and the peak can be up to 6 hours. So if you want to be totally safe, wait 6 hours before you take the next dose of an edible, and then at least you'll know what effect you're going to get from that dose.
All right, let's see. Looking at our questions, doesn't look like we have any new questions yet. Again, we're going to encourage anybody to send us your questions about cannabis. I'll go ahead and look a few up. Let's see. And we will keep monitoring the chat as well. So what is the difference between THC and CBD?
Okay, that's a great question. So when you look at cannabis as a plant, that contains both of those components found in nature. The THC is the component that has the psychomimetic effect, which gives you changes in your thought patterns. Whereas the CBD is kind of a mitigating factor found naturally in the plant. So it can actually help some of the adverse effects that you might get from THC otherwise. It tends to be more calming, and it's actually approved as a drug on its own for children with certain types of epilepsy. Some of the edibles actually have a blended product where there's maybe a 1-to-1 ratio of CBD and THC, or a 2-to-1 ratio. There are various different ratios, and people can play around with that to kind of mimic what the natural plant does to avoid some of the adverse effects. There are also some THC analogs that are out there now and available as either edibles or vapes. So there's Delta 8, which is roughly the same potency as Delta 9, which is what is in the natural cannabis plant. Delta 8, Poison and Drug Centers are seeing more adverse events from that, as people it tends to come in higher doses in the edibles, and people don't realize that they should treat it the same. There's a Delta 10, which actually often that's in combination with Delta 8, and kind of like CBD helps with the side effects of that. It's kind of an anti-THC. There is a THCO acetate, which is not quite as potent as the Delta 9, but and again, dosed kind of the same. So we have less information about the safety of these analogs, so I would just be extra cautious if you want to experiment there.
Yeah, I was going to say one of our viewers, Nicole, mentioned Delta 8 and asked, is it safe? So it sounds like you kind of addressed that. But the Michigan Poison and Drug Information Center chimed in and asked, can you explain the difference between Delta 8 and Delta 9 THC?
Okay, sure. So there is, in a natural plant, there is much more Delta 9 than there is Delta 8, but both are present naturally. To make a Delta 8 product, generally a manufacturer will start with CBD and actually do some chemical modifications. So it's just a slight difference in chemical structure between the two, and the resulting is that they're pretty much equally potent in terms of the effects on the body. It's just, if it's in an edible product, it isn't there naturally. They had to do some manufacturing process to make it.
I have a very interesting question from YouTube. This is from Miguel, and it is: recreational cannabis was just legalized in New Mexico. Do you see a future where independent pharmacies dispense cannabis to patients and help navigate drug interactions?
That's a great question, and as a pharmacist, I would say that there are already some states around us, I believe Colorado and Arizona, where there has to be a pharmacist present at a dispensary to answer such questions for people. That was not part of the New Mexico legislative process. I would fully support that being a future. If not, I don't think it's ever going to happen in pharmacies unless it's federally legalized, because pharmacists do not want to get into trouble federally. But in the dispensaries, I think that could be supported and be nice to work toward that.
Right. Looks like we have a question from Mary Beth. Hello from upstate New York. Can you talk about vaping cannabis versus eating, drinking, smoking, etc.?
Sure. So vaping cannabis has its own set of unique risks, and some of those may be resolved, and I'll explain that. So back in 2019 and into 2020, there were some kind of not well regulated products that contain THC that were put in vape solutions. And some of these manufacturers would put in vitamin E oil in particular to dilute the THC oil to make more money, essentially. And it turns out, by unfortunate circumstance of people being guinea pigs, is that a number of people who inhaled these products developed really severe lung injury. And it's called EVALI, electronic vaping associated lung injury. And I know Michigan Poison Center is online here, and I'm aware that they had a case of a young kid who had this and needed a lung transplant.
Oh my gosh.
So we have had several cases of that in New Mexico. Once the FDA and others realized that it was the vitamin E oil, I think a lot of those products were reformulated, and it still occurs periodically. So I would just make sure if you're vaping THC that you buy it from a dispensary and that you not buy it online.
Questions are streaming in now. So we have a question from Donald. What is the difference between the cannabis you buy at a dispensary and what you might get on the street?
Okay, so most of the cannabis on the street is going to be in the dried plant form. And it's going to be, I would say, more variable in potency. So you can grow certain strains of cannabis that have higher THC, and over time, over the last couple decades, the percent of THC in dried plant has increased. The advantage of going to a dispensary is they will farm certain brands and strains, and they will know that this strain has a high THC content, this strain has a low one, this strain has more CBD and therefore may have less side effects. So the dispensary can actually tell you, help guide you, what are you looking for to get out of this product? And here's a product I'd recommend for you. So you don't get that from a street vendor. You take what you get and what's available.
We have 2 additional questions from Alexander. Is it safe for a breastfeeding person to use cannabis?
So it's certainly safe for the breastfeeding person. The question is it safe for the infant? And, the THC that is in cannabis and the active component does get into the breast milk, so it is possible that an infant could get a dose that way. And of course, it would depend on the dose that the mom has taken. Generally, I would say smoking has not been an issue for breastfeeding. But again, if you're smoking, that secondhand smoke could be inhaled by the baby as they're breastfeeding. Secondhand smoke in general is not an issue, but in that young an infant, I would be concerned about it. So.
And is it basically the same thing for pregnant women as far as?
Yeah, for pregnant women, there's no association with birth defects or anything like that. And there's no, like some substances of abuse, for example, like opioids. If you use those in pregnancy, the baby goes into withdrawal.
Okay.
That doesn't happen with cannabis.
Okay.
Thank you. And he asked another question. Can secondhand cannabis smoke affect non-smokers, and to what degrees?
So for adults, there have actually been a number of studies where they put people in a small room to simulate maybe being in a vehicle, thinking that, there may be an excuse if you're pulled over and you test positive that, it was the person next to me smoking, not me. And that's pretty much been disproven. They put people in the room, half of whom were smoking and half who were not. And then they looked at their level of impairment and they measured the THC in their urine. And none of them triggered a urine that would result in any legal trouble, and none of them had any clinical symptoms. So even in a small room with heavy smoking, you don't have to worry about secondary exposure. It might be different with a young child. I think we just don't have the data on that.
Great. Let's see. So we are awaiting any new questions. Let's see. I'm checking all of the various platforms we are live on. Okay. Looks like we have no new questions, but I have a few here that I'd like to continue with. So what should somebody do if their pet or child unknowingly consumes cannabis? Is there a set of steps that they should take right away?
I think for a child, the most important step is to call your regional poison and drug information center, and they can help you assess, is this dose dangerous or not. If people are unwilling to call for a human, there is also an online poison center that our poison center participates in, and you can type in, it's called Web Poison Control. If you go to poison.org, easy to get to, you put in your child's age and weight and the substance they got into and the dose that they got into, and it will tell you whether you need to call the poison center or not, or whether you need to go directly to the emergency department. For cannabis, we don't refer people directly. If it's above a certain dose, we have them call the poison center. So that would be recommended for people. For animals, it's an interesting question. That's a little bit different. Dogs love to get into cannabis, especially, in them, you have an issue. Is it the chocolate bar that's more dangerous, or is it the cannabis? So dogs will get intoxicated with cannabis. They will act goofy. I'm not aware of too many serious issues with that. But that would be, and you can call many poison center and drug information centers do handle animal exposures. Ours does, for example. And you can ask whether depending on the symptoms the animal has, whether they need to go to a veterinarian. There is a veterinarian animal poison center run by ASPCA. They do charge for their services.
And that number to our poison center and to poison centers nationally is 1-800-222-1222.
And poison centers are available 24/7, and so there's always someone who's expert there to get an opinion from.
Yeah, and it looks like the Michigan Poison and Drug Information Center has shared the link on Facebook, at least, to the webpoisoncontrol.org website. So
Okay,
thank
great.
you.
Yep, thank you.
We have another question from Alexander. I have a friend who had cannabinoid hyperemesis, severe throwing up from usage of cannabis. Is this something parents should be aware of?
Well, I don't know if it's something parents should be aware of, but certainly people who use cannabis frequently and for a long period of time can develop this syndrome. Cannabis affects certain receptors in the body that can trigger this violent vomiting. It does take a large dose over several years or more. Not everybody develops this. When you do, some of the ways to relieve it, people find taking a warm shower will reduce the nausea and vomiting. And actually, there's an over-the-counter medication you can buy, capsaicin cream, which you can get in your pharmacy, and applying that, it counteracts the same receptor that's causing the issue. And rubbing that on the stomach, for example, may relieve the symptoms. But this will, once you have this, it will continue to recur. And really the only way to stop it is to discontinue use. And if you want to restart it at a lower, amount and frequency and see how it goes. But
so, with New Mexico legalizing recreational cannabis, is there any advantage, or are there any reasons to still pursue a medical use card or things like that? Do you have access to higher doses of cannabis, for instance, if you have a medical card, or is there any delineation between the two?
There isn't. I'm not totally familiar with the legislative aspects of this, but in terms of medical reasons, I believe if you have a medication card, you're going to be going to a dispensary where someone is familiar with the medication use, so the people selling you that may be able to provide more guidance. So I think there may still be advantage to having a medication card.
I'm going to be checking our platforms here, looking for any additional questions. And for those of you joining us, if you have any burning questions about cannabis, feel free to chat in, and we'll see about getting those answered. Let's see. Nothing quite yet. I just have a question in general about the trend we see in New Mexico with the legalization of recreational cannabis. From the poison center's perspective, are we seeing an increase of calls regarding concerns surrounding cannabis? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So our recreational legalization of cannabis occurred April 1st. And if we look at the calls of exposures to the poison center, and these could be accidental or someone who took it and had an adverse reaction and called us. So those calls basically from April on have doubled each month. But it's still not a huge number of calls. So it's about one call a day that we're getting on someone exposed who has an issue or just has a question. Not every child who gets into it develops symptoms at all. So these are just calls reflecting that an exposure occurred, not necessarily that anything bad happened.
All right, thank you. So what can you, so earlier you touched upon alcohol in some ways making the effects, kind of amplifying those effects, and you alluded to driving. Can you touch at all on driving and the operation of heavy machinery, well, simply on cannabis by itself?
Sure, that's going to be a lot dependent on the individual. So there have been some studies. Colorado had this recreational legalization long before we did in New Mexico, and they did a number of studies that are published about effects on driving, and they did some simulations where they gave someone a measured dose and then with or without alcohol and measured their ability to operate a simulated machine that would simulate driving. And they did show that at a pretty high dose that there is an impairment. So it affects your ability to drive a little differently than alcohol. So with alcohol, your
Delayed reaction
and all of that. With cannabis, it's more of difficulty in tracking and in perception. So for example, if a deer crosses the road, that's a sudden thing that you're not expecting, you're going to have a delayed recognition of that while you're under the influence of cannabis.
Interesting.
But it's not necessarily associated with greater fatal motor crashes, but it may, like I said, is at a high enough level in your blood, you may have impaired driving, and you just aren't going to react to unusual circumstances in the way that you would otherwise.
All right, so we have a couple of questions and some more information streaming in. One thing that was brought up is the difference between dispensaries and, of course, the medical use cannabis. Somebody brought up that those with medical cards do not pay taxes on their cannabis purchases, so that saves about 20%.
Oh, sure, that's a great comment. Glad to hear that.
And we have a question from Cynthia here, and so the question's more curiosity about there being a difference in dispensaries. So there is a difference between a let us say, dispensary that's authorized to provide medical or cannabis for medical purpose. So there is a difference?
There is a difference, yeah. Many, the dispensaries now, many have a different queue line for those purchasing for recreational use as compared to those purchasing for medicinal. And I think not every medicinal dispensary is offering recreational. Products. The products tend to be similar. There's no difference there. It's just the venue. And I know now we're having some designated cannabis use rooms in certain venues, so you have to get a license to be able to have the consumer consume in your facility as opposed to just take it home.
Much like a liquor license.
Like a liquor license, yeah. So.
We have a couple of questions here, so we'll just keep on rolling. Nicole asks, if my child gets into cannabis and I call the Poison Center, are you going to call Child Protective Services? We touched on this earlier, but I'll let you reiterate really quickly.
Sure, Nicole, that was one of our first questions we answered here. And, my comment is that cannabis is like any other accidental ingestion in a child, and generally the Poison Center staff will not call Child Protective Services. And each state is a little bit different in their rules about who should call, who has the onus to call. So in New Mexico, any healthcare provider, including our pharmacist, if we believe a child is in danger, then we need to call. But we spend a lot of time with the parents over the phone, and if we're assured that they're listening to our advice, they're doing the right thing, that they'll let us follow up, to make sure that child remains okay, we have no reason to refer them to CYFD. And I can probably count on one hand the number of times I've ever referred someone calling the Poison Center, and it's been cases where the parent was clearly negligent or dangerous substance that we told them to go to the hospital and they refused to go. Then we have a need to protect that child. But it's rare.
Let's see. Kevin asks, if a child is known to have consumed cannabis, should parents be scared of death, and what immediate steps should they take? So again, we kind of touched on this, but I'll let you. We haven't touched on possible death. Can you?
Sure, it's very unusual. Like, we have not had any deaths in children from cannabis in New Mexico, and it's rarely reported. So it does have the advantage of having a little bit of a slower onset. So if you notice the child, not breathing well, if the parent knows CPR, if the child's not breathing, then that's what you would do. You would call 911, you would follow their guidance. But most of the time, the Poison Center specialists can help you keep that child safely at home. But if it looks like a dangerous situation, we'll have you call for an ambulance. There really isn't any home treatment you can do other than, closely observe the child. We have a recommendation called supervised napping. So if the child just took enough under the threshold for which we would refer in and is just a little bit drowsy, as an adult would be, we make sure that at least for a little while, 30 minutes to an hour, that there's a parent or somebody who's adult watching that child while they're sleeping.
We have another question from Joe. Do dispensaries offer, I guess we can open this to anybody, or does any service, but do dispensaries offer any training for users new to edibles?
I don't really have knowledge of what the dispensaries offer. I know they do make suggestions, like you should use this strain if you're new, if you have this condition, use that strain, and they may recommend dosing and various products. So you will get some recommendation, and many of them do undergo some training.
Do you know where somebody can find this information, a reputable source perhaps?
So just for general information?
Yeah, let us say general information about use or things to look out for. Or let us say it's not necessarily something that would merit a call, but maybe preemptively. Is there resources for people that want to preemptively learn about it?
Jacqueline, are you aware of anything?
I am not really aware of any kind of like clearinghouse of sorts yet regarding cannabis, since it is so just barely got passed. I haven't heard of anything like that, but we do have concerning safe storage and some other basic information. We do have a handout here at the Poison Center that if you were to visit our website, you could certainly contact me or contact the center and we could get that information out to you. And it's posted up on our website as well, and you can view it and download it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Our health department also has that same brochure for safe storage, and they have a dedicated web page for cannabis that I think they plan to add things to it as we gain more experience here.
As so do
we.
we have a dedicated web page for that solely on cannabis. So yeah, visit our website, nmpoisoncenter.unm.edu, and you will find that information right on the front page.
And the Michigan Poison and Drug Information Center asks, are your dispensaries willing to provide poison prevention stickers or magnets to customers? Is there any a collaboration with them?
There isn't a direct collaboration. I think that's a great idea. We would like it if that would occur. But we do have one dispensary that has worked with us and has at least shared their product information so that when somebody does call, we can provide more information, and that's Ultra Health.
All right. Well, we can look at a few of the. If anybody has any other questions, please feel free to chat in. Let me look around at our various platforms here. Let's see. Can you, this is a question I'm curious about, can you become addicted to cannabis?
You cannot become addicted per se, in that you generally, it's an addiction generally involves needing higher and higher doses to get the same effect. That's called tolerance. And generally, that may occur to some degree with cannabis, but not so much. But if you stopped it suddenly, the withdrawal is not really too bad. Not major, not needing hospitalization. And you may have some craving, which is another component of addiction if you're chronically using it, but it just has not been a huge issue.
Curious about the effects that cannabis has on psychotic disorders. Can they worsen or potentially, can cannabis products worsen or potentially cause psychotic disorders?
Okay, that's a great question. So there have been some studies on an association between cannabis use and psychosis. An association is basically the best we can do for these studies because we can't deliberately give people cannabis and follow them to see if they develop a psychosis. So, were they predisposed to psychosis and then the cannabis triggered it, or did the cannabis trigger the psychosis? We can't differentiate that out. But there is a small percentage of people who will develop a psychosis. This is more common if the younger you are when you start your cannabis. So this is why, at least in New Mexico, we cannot sell this to someone under the age of 21. So your brain is still developing, and many psychotic disorders first manifest in a teenager, a 15 or 16-year-old. So cannabis just makes that possibly more likely, but more confusing. I have seen a couple patients at bedside who presented shortly after their first use, generally adolescents, who had an acute psychotic reaction, which got better and never recurred after they were out of the hospital. So and that would be, like I said, of all the thousands of patients I've seen at bedside, that's one or two. So it's not particularly common, but we do have highly concentrated THC now in our dried plant, and if we generate a plant that doesn't have the CBD in it but just has the THC, I think it's possible we'll see more of that with time.
Does the method of consumption affect the potency? So, for instance, oral consumption, topical use, or smoking or vaping, is there any known method of consumption that has an effect on the potency?
Not necessarily the potency, but the route does affect the onset. So if you smoke it, you're going to get a rapid onset within 5 minutes, generally. If you ingest it, you will get a slower onset, as I mentioned, up to 6 hours potentially. And if you rub it on the skin, it's not very well absorbed through the skin, so the topical products are just not a concern in terms of causing side effects or having any absorbed that way.
All right, thank you. I'm going to look at our platforms here, see if we have any new questions. looks like we don't have, looks like we have some thanks. So thanks for doing this from Kevin on Facebook. It's refreshing that this was not a fear-based anti-cannabis event. So we've been thanked for that.
You're welcome, Kevin.
All right, looking for more questions here.
Can you, while we're waiting, can you talk a little bit to the audience about how wax is manufactured and developed?
Oh, sure.
And why, and the potency of it?
Sure. So wax or butter or dab,
Yeah.
those are all terms for really highly concentrated, almost 100% THC. So you can buy kits or buy this product here in the dispensaries. But the kits involve you taking butane, which is a solvent, a gas under pressure. And you'll put generally it's done with your leftover twigs and stems, the part you normally don't smoke.
Uh-huh.
So you put that into this plastic tube or glass tube. I think it's usually glass. And then you put your solvent and release it. So the solvent goes through it and extracts the THC, which drips out in the bottom.
Okay.
And you end up with this yellowish liquid. And then you may evaporate the liquid to make it more solid, and it looks like earwax, hence it's called wax. And then generally the way that is used is by smoking, but it's so highly potent that you take a heat source and
like a dab pen.
Like a dab pen, stick it on the dab, it will generate something that you can inhale through a straw or just inhale.
Right.
So you get
that.
It's just an alternate way of smoking, and some of the edible products actually start with that and use that because you have a pretty concentrated product with a defined dose, and you can then divide enough of that to make a 5 milligram per gummy product.
Okay. And it sounds much like resin or hash, kind of like the.
Yeah, hash is generally it's less refined and less concentrated.
Okay.
I have a pretty interesting question here. How long do the effects of cannabis last?
So the duration does depend on the route. So if you smoke it, it can dissipate within an hour or two. If you swallow it, it may take 8 to 12 hours before you're totally resolved. But generally within a day, a dose is out of your system. Out of your system meaning out of your system that affects your behavior. THC remains in the body for a long time. So if you, inactive but for a long time. So if you did a urine drug screen, it could be positive for several weeks or a month if you're a consistent user.
Now, do they do the hair test anymore?
Hair tests are not reliable for pretty much anything.
And how about blood tests?
Blood tests are only used for like driving while intoxicated cases or forensic reasons, where you need to know if someone dies and you think it may be involved, they may measure it in the blood. It's usually urine, and it's a metabolite of THC that they're measuring.
Okay.
And you can buy home kits to measure this.
I can't. The urine doesn't seem like it can be quantified, though. Like how much did they take? But blood,
you
on the other hand,
you can quantify it. So for autopsies, we quantify it. But for regular purposes,
it's there, it's
for
not.
Department of Transportation, they have a cutoff level.
Okay.
So they'll, NIDA defines a cutoff level.
Got
And
you.
if you're above the cutoff level, you're positive. If you're just slightly below it, you're negative.
Okay.
So we had a comment regarding dabs from Kevin on Facebook. He says, dabs do not involve combustion and are vapor instead. Less bad stuff than smoke, he says. And we have a question from Cynthia. I've used CBD isolate to make topical creams and would like to add THC isolate. Any concerns for someone who's just starting this process?
Interesting. You know, because THC isn't that well absorbed, I think unless you put it on an abraded surface, like if you had a wound and you were applying the cream to a wound, I think that might be a concern. And there may be a concern with you playing with it to make this formulation if you don't wear gloves. So we actually had an interesting case of hyperemesis syndrome in someone who was making their own THC products, not wearing gloves, had abraded skin.
Oh, wow.
And absorbed it through the skin and got this hyperemesis. And he kept presenting multiple times to the hospital, and no one figured it out until he disclosed his occupation.
Oh.
So that would be pretty rare, I think, but I would just be concerned if you were preparing this at home that you have some kind of protection on your hands.
Yeah, good point. Let's see. Looking through our streams a few more times here. Looks like we don't have any new questions, but if anybody has any questions, feel free to chat in. We are going to be live until 1 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time. So feel free to ask any last questions we haven't covered over the hour, and we'll be sure to answer those. Let's see here. I have a question just in general regarding this session. Do you think the New Mexico Poison and Drug Information Center will be hosting more Q&A sessions like this? Can you tell us?
Most definitely, yeah. So we're going to start using these platforms a lot more regularly on various topics. So we will, again, let everyone know what that's going to be about, and so you can join in if you're interested.
I think I would also suggest if you go to our Facebook page, since you're
Yes.
there now, if you want to suggest a future topic,
Yeah,
we
perfect.
we would look forward to
Perfect, yes.
recommendations.
Good idea. And like us, follow us, please.
Yes, of course. All right. Another question here. When it comes to memory, does cannabis have any temporary or long-term effects on memory?
Cannabis, particularly in the adolescent brain, more so than adults. So yes, it can, there's some songs about that, right? So it can have short-term effect on memory generally. And that there are some studies, particularly those studies I mentioned with driving, where they looked at memory. Some of those effects can last a while. So after you stop using, there may be a residual impairment of memory. It will come back. It's not permanent. And there are some also studies showing that if you were to image the brain of someone intoxicated with cannabis and then image a brain of someone with attention deficit disorder, those brains can look similar.
Oh, that's interesting.
So,
Wow.
yeah, again, temporary.
Can encounters with cannabis vary from one to the next?
Well, yeah, anything's variable. So, I would say, the same person with the same dose, with the same route, with the same product should have a consistent effect. But again, if it's too soon, if you take that edible every 2 hours, you're going to have a different effect on dose 4 than dose 1 because you've built it up in your bloodstream.
All right. Looks like we're 5 minutes out. I'm going to go ahead and remind everybody to send in your questions if you have any. Again, let's see. We'll see if anybody else. Just a lot of thanks from the folks on our Facebook page.
You're
few
welcome.
Thanks. Yeah. Let's see.
Well, if I have a couple minutes, I did want to dovetail on what Kevin had said about the dabs. because I think you need to recognize that dried plant cannabis has hundreds of inactive and active components, and when you smoke that, somewhat like cigarettes, you do inhale products of combustion that are released. It hasn't worked out, at least currently, to have the same association with lung cancer as cigarettes do, as nicotine does, but you are getting many different components when you smoke a dried plant compared to when you smoke from a dab.
The Michigan Poison and Drug Information Center says, great information. Thank you for answering questions that people may not want to ask but need answers for if they use cannabis, THC, or have it in their homes.
You're welcome.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're going to hang out here for another 4 minutes. So another reminder, if any of you have any questions about cannabis, please take the opportunity to chat in your question now. All right. Well, it looks like we have no new questions. I'm sure we didn't cover it all, but
Yeah, I'd like, as a final reminder, just to remind people of our nationwide phone call that's 24/7, the 1-800-222-1222. That works anywhere in the United States and in the territories. And also remember that Web Poison Control is available not only as a website, but you can download it as an app on your phone. And if you are reluctant to call the Poison Center or not sure whether you should call, that's an excellent resource.
And program yourselves with our number as well, because you never know when you might need our help.
actually I'm going to go ahead and post it into the chat here, and after our session I'll be
Perfect.
sure it's featured
Great, thanks, Jose.
as well. So I'm going to go ahead and, for all poison and drug related needs, please give us a call. And as we wind down the hour, I'm going to look for any last questions that we might have missed. Looks like everything has been addressed. And one good thing that we can finish with is just remind everyone who we're sitting with here, and we can prepare to sign off.
I'm Jacqueline Kakis. I'm the Health Education Consultant for the New Mexico Poison and Drug Information Center. Once again, thanks so much for joining our conversation today.
And I'm Dr. Susan Smolinski. I'm the director of the New Mexico Poison and Drug Information Center, and it's been wonderful to chat with everyone and be able to provide this information. Thanks for listening.
All right, and it is now, the time is 12:59 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time. So we're going to go ahead and thank everyone for joining us today, and we will be signing off. Thank you very much.